Hi and welcome to the second post-flop video, where we're going to talk about the thought processes we should have before the flop, turn or river is dealt. Depending on how quickly the cards are dealt, you may need a little longer to process the information. That's entirely normal. Much of this is information we should have already considered at the very beginning of the hand, and all we're really doing here is bringing it back briefly to the forefront of our minds, so we're not forgetting any key ingredients. We're focusing on the 5 elements on the left hand side of the screen: to spar, tournament situation, opponents, SPR, position, and previous action. For tournament players, you ought to be considering these questions at the beginning of each hand. During the post-flop action, if you can remind yourself of any important factor, particularly with regard to any ICM pressure, that's going to be valuable. It's easy to just push this off to the side once you're engulfed in the post-flop action, but tournament situation factors still matter post-flop. The chips you stand to win may be worth considerably less than the chips you stand to lose. So all your post-flop ranges are going to be affected. I'm not saying you should drill through all of these questions again before every post-flop decision, but you need to find a balance between ignoring it completely and spending too much time repeating the same information. Post-flop, we can be more streamlined in how we consider our opponents. It's good to start by noting how many players are active. Often it will just be 2 players and you can focus all your energy on the one opponent. Other times you'll have to negotiate a multi-way flop. Here are some tips on how to deal with them. Bluffing is more problematic in multi-way pots, as the more opponents you face, the less likely your bluff is to succeed. You need to actually have a good hand more often. This means the more opponents are in the pot, the more value heavy the ranges should be. It doesn't mean you should never bluff though. It does mean there should be fewer bluffing combinations chosen. One pair hands can fare well in heads up pots, but in multi-way pots you are frequently going to need a stronger hand. Marginal hands lose some strength and drawing hands are more attractive. All forms of deception don't work as well in multi-way pots. So not only should you bluff with lower frequencies, but you should also avoid other elaborate plays and tend to keep things simpler. Slow playing, for example, works better in heads-up pots than in multi-way pots. The final piece of advice I have for you in multi-way pots is to pay attention to the pot odds. You often get a very good price, so don't fall into the trap of overfolding. As you continue to consider the profiles of the active opponents, you might have time to think about their post-flop behaviour. This will often be a simple gauge of how aggressive they are, but it could also involve some more detailed analysis if you know a player well. If you're playing online, you might glance at their post-flop aggression statistics or data specific to the street you're on. If you're playing live, you will have more time but less information at your fingertips. Here are some tips for considering opponent aggression. Making assumptions is dangerous. I'm not saying you should ignore your feelings, but try and keep your thoughts evidence-based, otherwise you might start making mistakes. Very often for both online and live players, you won't have a huge amount of data to work with when analysing the post-flop behaviour of villains. Online players using HUDs should keep an eye out for extreme behaviour, where villains are choosing very high or very low frequencies for certain actions. One of the biggest mistakes players make when using HUDs is failing to take into consideration sample size. If you have fewer than 10 examples of something, that's not a good sample, and you shouldn't be making sweeping assumptions based on limited data. For live players, unless you play against the same villains every week, you're unlikely to gather enough post-flop data to go into too much detail. Keep things simple. You can get meaningful information from small sample sizes when hands get revealed. Look out for how opponents play drawing hands or which cards they are choosing to bluff with. These revealed hands give a lot of information about how villains like to play. The wilder the behaviour is, the more valuable the information is. If you catch an opponent opening with 8-4 offsuit in early position, or checking down all the streets with a full house, then you have justification for making certain assumptions. The final point here is aimed at online players. The aggression statistics on heads-up displays are very useful. Many people don't fully understand how they work. If you need help with these, I wrote a blog on this a few years ago, which you will find enlightening. You can take things one step further if you have the time. You can start to explore any specific weakness in an opponent, particularly with regard to his next decision, though you could also be thinking ahead to future streets. I'm talking again about staying one move ahead. You should be anticipating his next move, considering what leak he might have, understanding how you can exploit that leak, and, if possible, planning your next move and the betting line you might take. It's a lot of planning. It's not always possible to do all of this, but if you can, it's time well spent. The final question here concerns our opponent's levels of thinking. If you can answer this question, it can help you prepare to exploit your opponents appropriately. For example, if you're facing a calling station thinking on level 1, you know your betting range will consist of many value hands, even thin value hands, and you can choose a large sizing. You're thinking ahead to the type of deviations you are going to make against this villain. Pinpointing which level of thinking an opponent is on is tricky. Live players might find it easier, as opponents do reveal a lot of information when they discuss hands. Once you know what level an opponent is on, always aim to play poker just one level ahead of him, keeping things as simple as possible. Stack to pot ratio is a key measurement that you must calculate before or as the flop is dealt. Don't skip this at the flop stage. If you're not in the habit of using SPR, this is one of the most important new habits you need to form. It's particularly important for tournament players and for any situation when the SPR is smaller than 6. The first question you should already know the answer to from considering how many active opponents are left in the pot. If it's a multi-way pot, you need to pay extra attention to who the effective stack is from your perspective. If it's a heads-up pot, the effective stack is simply the smaller of the two. Divide the effective stack by the effective pot to establish the SPR. Do this before every single flop. Traditionally, this is a flop-only measurement, but as long as you have an understanding of pot geometry, you can calculate it at any point during the post-flop action. It's simply the effective stack divided by the effective pot. That's all you need to do. The reason SPR is so important is it helps you gauge how committed you are to a pot and then plan how to navigate the rest of the hand, including what bet sizes to choose. Of course, there are other important factors which influence bet sizing, but SPR is one which is frequently ignored and yet is probably the most important of all. I've seen countless players of all abilities get themselves in a tangle in pots because they failed to plan bet sizes across the post-flop streets. Let me give you some brief tips on handling high, medium and small SPRs. If you play cash games or any deep stacked situation, you will frequently wind up with high SPRs where pot geometry is less important. You aren't going to get committed to hands very often, so all of this is less relevant. Drawing hands fare well as you're in a low risk, high reward situation. For medium SPRs, be careful getting overcommitted to one pair hands or marginal holdings. Try and exercise some pot control either by using smaller sizings or checking a street. In low SPR spots, it's important to do some bet size planning. The biggest mistake people make in low SPR situations is overfolding. As part of this course, I've included a PDF document of a matrix which I use to help choose bet sizes which force the action all in. I'm not saying you should always look to end up all in low SPR pots, that would be ridiculous, but you do need to understand that it's often correct to commit all your chips without a strong hand, and if you're prepared to put this money in, you might as well be prepared by choosing smart sizings that pressurize your opponents into making mistakes. Position is easy. Simply take note of your position relative to the other active players. You can combine this with thoughts about the pre-flop action if you wish. You should be noting who is sat where and what their actions were. The questions I recommend here are: what was the pre-flop action? Do any ranges need updating? Who is the aggressor in the pot? And what's likely to happen next? These are all key elements of every hand. As you enter the post-flop action, you need to know your relative position, who the aggressor is, and the action in front of you. In fact, these elements are precisely what helped me divide up all post-flop situations into 6 scenarios, which were an integral part of my books, Postflop Volumes 1 and 2. If you're intrigued by this, there's a slide on it coming up in the next video. So here we're quickly reviewing the pre-flop action. Sometimes a lot has happened, other times it's really straightforward. But whatever's taken place, try going through it like a commentator would. Keep it in your mind who the aggressor is and think about what might happen next. If something different happens from what you imagined, that's okay. Your thoughts were not wasted. Thinking one move ahead might sometimes feel like a futile exercise, but it's a really good habit to be in, and I strongly encourage you to do this when playing any turn-based strategy game. I know it's a lot of information to process in a very small amount of time. If the cards are dealt whilst you're still thinking it all through, don't panic. Do your best to get through what you can. Then move on to BAP God H. You'll find this a lot easier to practice during study time, where you can improve your efficiency and speed of thought. Join me for the next video and we'll finish off the post-flop thought processes.